Welcome, everyone. So glad you're able to join us today. If you're here for the first time or you're a long-standing regular, you're all extremely welcome. We're sad to say that this is the last in our series on investment for this year. We've covered a lot of ground, and if you haven't been able to join us so far, we're hoping that today's session will be able to nonetheless provoke and challenge you, perhaps in ways that the rest of us have been left reverberating with some of the thoughts and the impressions that God is leading us to invest our lives and our resources and our energies in ways that allow us to be found faithful. So we've got a couple of speakers with us today. Joe is I spent the last 20 years serving with business in mission, the resource team, developing business as mission networks and resources. And Martin, he's the president and chief executive of FaithInvest, an international specialist in all major faiths and religious traditions and cultures, and encouraging them to consider how they might invest in a godly way. So we're going to allow them to introduce themselves when they get to speak. I guess from my point of view, this particular series has provoked me in perhaps two specific ways. I've been very challenged to think about investment and the need for hope, and hope being the positive expectation of good things to come. And for me, in my own particular life, I've noticed that disillusionment and discouragement can neuter hope, which of course then reduces my enthusiasm and my appetite for being future orientated. And as a child of God, somebody who's been made in the image of God, that challenge to be future-minded, as our Creator obviously has been in creating the planet, in creating us and thinking about us, is fundamental to investment, the need for hope. And so perhaps one of the things that we need to be thinking about, I am certainly considering, is being mindful of discouragement and disillusionment, particularly with the status quo, and when things can be, as they have been in this country, quite severe and quite difficult for so many. The other thing I've been challenged about is this idea of this injunction, this mandate or this edict we feel to be wise and faithful stewards. And that mandate isn't on me per se, but it's upon Christ who's alive in me. Because the life that I live by faith in Christ. And so I found great consolation in that as responsible, as heavy, as weighty as this charge is for us to be good and faithful stewards of that which we've been invested with, and are to invest ourselves and our energies and our responsibilities with. That responsibility is given to me and equipped and graced by God's life and his power at work in me. So I'm hoping that we're going to get an even deeper and broader perspective on that and so much more from our two speakers. We're going to hear from Martin first. Martin is going to be talking to us about the investments, the charge of faith and its role in investment. Martin, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Rob, and thank you for those 2 moments of of reflection. Yes, my name is Martin Plummer. I'm the founder and CEO of FaithInvest. We are an international body that works with every major religion around the world. From every country pretty much in the world, helping the faiths to do something they've not been very good at doing, and that is being actually faithful and faith consistent in their investments. And this comes out of the fact that for 35 years, I was the religious advisor to His Royal Highness Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, on religion and the environment. And he and I, back in 1986, launched the first ever meeting between the major religions and the major environmental groups, not just WWF, that he was international president of, but all the major bodies, including the World Bank and the UN and other such bodies, where we began to explore the fact that every single faith has an understanding of our place in nature. Not all of them are stewardship. That is only an Abrahamic concept. It does not exist in any of the other faiths at all. In the other faiths, it has a very different sense of being part of a cycle of life rather than being, as it were, at the top of the cycle. And within Orthodox Christianity, which Prince Philip, of course, came out of, he was brought up as Orthodox, there is a wonderful image that we are the priests of creation. And just as a priest stands before the congregation and is a channel for the grace of God and a channel for the prayers of the faithful back to God, so that is our role as well. And I think sometimes we ignore the sacramental role that we have within the Christian tradition for a rather managerial role. Now, obviously, with a group like you, management is a little bit closer to your heart, possibly, than sacrament, but that's something we might explore. But basically, our challenge to the faiths was, if you believe in God, or if you believe in some force that lies behind the purpose of creation, then surely to God, to put it mildly, you should be caring for creation. And so for many years, we have worked with every major faith tradition, with all the major Christian traditions around the world, to help them delve deep into what they believe. What is it that they actually believe? What is it they teach? What is it that they practice? Because so often when we talk about religion, we end up talking about the beliefs, but we don't talk much about the practice. And it's the practice that really makes the difference. Something I know all of you are in this group precisely because you believe that. And over that period of time, since 1986, when we first brought the faiths together, we did a lot of exploring as to the role of the faiths. And from the environmental movement's point of view, they thought we were useful as preachers. We would preach the message on a Friday in the synagogue, in the mosque, in a Saturday in the synagogue, Sunday in the church, that the environmental movement wanted us to preach. And we had to fairly swiftly disillusion them to that and say, no, the faiths will do what they do because of what they believe, not because of what somebody else tells them they should do. But if there are areas where what we as faithful people believe chimes with what you as environmental scientists, as economists, politicians, etc., think is actually crucial and vital, then we can look at partnerships. And we have hundreds of partnerships around the world with every major group. But the main thing that came out of all this work was a realization that the faiths simply had no idea how institutionally they were one of the largest stakeholders in the planet. There was a sort of attitude in the faiths that basically, we do good, we preach good things, and we do nice services, and we care for the elderly, and we look after the sick, and so on and so forth. Yes, that's absolutely crucial, and that's where an awful lot of the money from investments goes into supporting the good work of faiths, regardless of what faith it is. It's a central element of it. But actually, we are stakeholders. 50% of all schools around the world are faith-based or faith-involved in some way. A third of all universities, a third of all medical facilities. And we are the fourth largest investing group in the world. We are immensely influential. And we have ignored the degree to which we are influential. And that's why FaithInvest came into being. We work with every major faith at an institutional level. And we say to them, okay, this is great what you do with the money you get, but where does the money come from? How faith consistent, to use a phrase that is now adopted right across the world, how faith consistent are your investments? How faith consistent is the bank that you invest with? Is it a sustainable bank? If you're investing with HSBC, think again. Largest single contributor to funding for fossil fuels. So how do we, as the faithful, actually make sure that not only what we do with our money is good, but how we get that money in the first place. And so FaithInvest exists precisely to do that with major institutions. We work with every major religious organization around the world. We've helped, for example, create the first ever Buddhist pension fund, because it was assumed that if you were a Buddhist monk or a nun, you just died in the saddle. But nowadays they all live so much longer, but suffer from old age and dementia and sickness that they need a pension fund. We work with the Mormons. Mormons have just declared they have 100 billion invested, and so we're helping them to develop a program. We work with the Church of England. We've set up the advisory committee for the Laudato Si program of the Catholic Church, and run through our website, FaithInvest, the Catholic Investors Hub, and have helped design the new structure for the Vatican Bank, which was a wee bit like sort of cleaning out the Aegean stables, frankly, but that's another story for another time. But the heart of this is, how can you, as business people, help drive this? You can help drive this in a very simple way. The things you're already doing are impressive. I've looked at some of the stuff that's coming out of this whole year of study. But more importantly, you can beginning to ask questions of your own faith structures. How faith consistent is our investment policy? What is our investment policy? How does it relate to our beliefs? So that's something that you can do. We work very closely, for example, with the Transformational Business Network, particularly in Asia, but increasingly now worldwide. These are religious people who are business people and investors who are now looking to what their faith is saying about guidelines, and we're helping create guidelines in every major faith. What is it to be faith consistent? And finally, I was very encouraged to hear that this whole program was triggered by COP26, and FaithInvest was one of the groups very centrally involved with the World Bank and the UN in structuring the civil society component of COP26, and we are deeply involved in the same process for COP27 in Egypt in November. And at that, we will be launching a multi-faith just transition fund into which major religious funds can invest for significant, substantial infrastructure development that will be faith consistent, and it will also be addressing climate issues. But I'm delighted to say that if this is all right with all of you, I want to share also at a big event we're hosting in October, later in October, with the UN and with the World Bank, the fact that your group has actually gone into this precisely because of the issues that were raised at COP26. I find that hugely encouraging. Rob talked about hope. That gives me hope. And sometimes when I'm having to discuss with major structures of faith, you need an awful lot of hope. Quite a bit of hope as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Martin. I was so struck by that idea of our need to invest as sacrament, as standing before God, as priests before him, but also before one another. And yeah, very thought-provoking. Thank you so much for that. Joe, you're going to bring a different perspective to this conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, shall I just take it away?
Yes, please do.
Okay, hi everyone. My name's Joe. I'm the founder and creative director of Business Mission Global, which is a network of networks internationally that are using business intentionally in mission. So I often start, if I'm doing a talk, I often start with a quote on business from Dallas Willard, which is one of my favorites. And Dallas Willard said this about business. He said, "Business is a primary moving force of the love of God in human history." And I like that quote because it just very simply in one line says that business is God's idea. It's inherently good. Although it can, of course, be corrupted by sin, it is part of God's good design, and it's a force for good in the world. And you, FIB regulars, you don't need me to tell you this, but because business drives forward innovation through creativity, through taking risks, through hard work. It multiplies wealth as we steward resources and labor. It creates good jobs and livelihood, or it can do. It's the primary way that people, families, communities, and whole nations provide for themselves. And out of the excess of that provision, we're able to care for the poor, as we're instructed in Scripture, particularly the vulnerable and those who can't work. It brings business and enterprise brings needed products and services into an area and drives development and quality of life. And of course, a role in business gives us a voice, not only in our company, but in our community, in our nation, even as we do things like pay taxes. And so business helps humans flourish. And so what I'm trying to say with that, as you know all of that, is that we don't have to attach a mission strategy to business in order for it to have potential to glorify God and do good. And of course, work is where we spend much of our waking lives. Business is built on a network of relationships. So there's much scope for us to be very intentional about bringing our faith in Jesus into our work and business. And that's what faith in business is all about. But I have spent the last 20 years or so championing this idea of business as mission. And that is really when we very intentionally integrate business and mission together. I think of it like water or wind, which has a natural innate power and purpose of its own, but then we can harness that power of water or wind and kind of channel it and use it very intentionally. And I think of business the same way. We can intentionally channel that innate power of business very intentionally in the mission of the church as we respond to God's missional heart. And also, I'm very passionate that business know-how, skills, experience, ability to start up and grow enterprises is one of the most needed in contemporary mission today. Or to put it another way, we need intentionally missional focused business solutions to the world's most pressing issues. And Martin has already touched on some of those, including some environmental issues, which need policy, but also market solutions. But those pressing issues also include things like extreme poverty, vulnerability to exploitation and injustice that poverty exposes, human trafficking and slavery, which is a multi-million-pound industry, the current refugee crisis. A lot of the answer to what those people are going to be helped long-term will be through small business creation, things like corruption, and also unreached peoples, because Jesus said, go and make disciples of all nations. And so many people haven't heard about him yet. And it's difficult to go into places as a traditional missionary, but business, the world is open for business everywhere. And of course, these new business solutions to the world's most pressing issues need investment. So Martin has given us a macro view of an institutional view of faith, the need for faith institutions to be very mindful in their investments. And I'm talking more on an individual investor level, individual business level, starting up companies and the investment needed for those. It's absolutely crucial that we have investors with this missional mindset that understand that power of business as part of the church's mission in the world today. Before I get onto that and some resources on that, I just really want to just share a little bit about what business's mission is. We sometimes talk about business's mission being for-profit enterprise that seeks to have a positive impact on 4 bottom lines in response to 3 mandates from God. So let me say that again. For-profit enterprises having a positive impact on 4 bottom lines in response to the 3 mandates from God. Those 4 bottom lines, of course, financial bottom line. We want to have positive economic impact, profit, the social and environmental bottom lines that we've just been talking about, because we realize there's more stakeholders, and then spiritual impact, positive spiritual impact and transformation, bringing proclamation opportunities through businesses, through daily business life. And all of that is part of God's purpose. So that's having multiple impacts in financial, social, environmental, and spiritual. And then in response to 3 mandates, we've already talked about the creation mandate, the command to steward creation and flourish as human beings, but also the greatest commandment to love our God, and then our neighbor as ourselves. And what we've seen is that often what our neighbor needs most is a good job. And then, of course, the Great Commission to go and make disciples of all nations, teaching them all I've commanded. And what better way to teach Jesus's way of living, the values we see in Scripture that are important to God, demonstrating the fruits of the Spirit and the one another's through daily business life. So business is a very powerful way, and you know this already, to bring that very integrated, holistic transformation in places that most need it, the least, the last, the lost, people who have never heard Jesus, people who are struggling with dire poverty, but also closer to home in marginalized people that are just around us all the time in our communities. And investors and investment companies are crucial in this picture. Around every business, we need an ecosystem that is going to help those missional focused businesses flourish. Investment is part of that. I think I'm just going to wrap up now because my time is almost done. But just to touch for a moment on investment, Martin already mentioned Transformational Business Network. I want to recommend to you the Transformational SME, which is, I'll post the link to these resources in a minute, which is an organization that actually has an investment fund which channels investment money into companies like the ones I've talked about in the 1040 window, which is among the least reach and poorest parts of the world. And then I also want to refer you to a blog series we've just posted on the Business's Mission blog, and it's all on the being a steward investor, and it's done in partnership with a guy called Don Simmons, who's just released a new book called The Steward Investor, because he really feels that we're not just everybody has financial stewards to financial resources to steward, and how can we align those investments, those financial investments, with God's eternal purposes. So I think I'll leave it there and answer any other questions that you have for me. Anon.
Thanks so much, Joe. If you do have any questions for Martin and Joe, please do pop it in the chat. And we've got a few minutes together now before we move over into Q&A. So if you've got a question, slip it in and hopefully we'll be able to fit that in. But before I go to your questions, if I make an observation that perhaps Joe and Martin, you can reflect back on, it seems to me that if Martin, if our faith institutions aren't aware of our influence and our impact, and Joe, businesses aren't aware of their scope and their opportunity for being businesses on a mission, then perhaps your work is 2 sides of the same coin.
Yeah,
I would agree entirely. I mean, I think we can only help the major institutions shift if they feel that there is a demand for them to be faithful. And one of the astonishing things about most of the religious investment funds is that they don't manage their own funds. They've outhoused them to fund managers. And frankly, although they might have a historic tradition of negative screening, within Islam, no usury, no charging of interest; within the Quakers, nothing to do with armaments, etc. They've been fairly thin on any value-driven basis for that investment. It's been a focus on, well, we get the money, we don't ask too many questions. And in a sense, we should be asking questions, because frankly, we have a deeply, deeply wrong economic system, a system that is actually so against the gospel, it's almost breathtaking. that it can exist in this way, and that good people have basically turned a blind eye. You know, take the story of the Good Samaritan. Who are the figures that Jesus mocks for not going to the help of the person who has been beaten up and left by the roadside? Religious figures. Well, I'm afraid we're in that situation with many of our institutions right across the world. So there is a profound need for that to be challenged. But I think also, as individuals, as investors, you can also set a model. Many people on this call will be trustees of boards of foundations. Many of you will be involved in development agencies and funding. But so much of the development agency funding is given as a grant that locks people into basically a service model rather than a self-sufficiency model. And one of the things that we're working with the ACT Alliance, for example, the gathering of about 140 Christian development agencies, is saying, look, why don't you put 15, maybe even 20% of your grants aside as actual investment? Don't give it as grants, invest it. Help people to actually develop a business plan. Help them to do due diligence. Help them to find potential investors. You were going to spend it anyway. This way, you might actually get a return. And that shift of thinking from it's good enough to do charity to no, it's not good enough to do charity. It really is not good enough to do charity. And Joe's wonderful description of, in a sense, every major religion sees finance as energy. It's a gift of the spirits. It's what drives us forward. It can drive us down the wrong path quite easily. And that's why you have to have that sense of beliefs and values that then guide what you actually do. So I couldn't agree more, Rob. I think, you know, and I'm Joe, I was not aware of the degree of your work, and I'm fascinated by it. So yeah.
Likewise.
Already an advantage, already an advantage.
Yeah, I think we do a lot of affirmation of business people who don't realize that actually their skills and gifts are one of the most needed in mission today, and also affirmation of investors that their money can have power in this sort of through these transformational enterprises, and then making those connections, you know, building bridges to allow this flow of capital. So I put a few links in the chat. I think what we need to do is to start accessing these broader areas of funding into these sort of very intentional kingdom businesses that are growing around the world, multiplying, not just in Western places. This week I had a chat with a guy who's from his Luo tribe from Western Kenya, and he got mobilized into this idea of business as mission, is starting 2 businesses, detergent manufacturing and poultry rearing, in his community in Luoland in Western Kenya, to bring transformation essentially to that area. So the Holy Spirit is doing things around the world.
Amazing. Yeah, it's one of the things I found quite stunning in going into this area over the last decade or so. So there's within the Catholic Church, there's an amazing movement, a lay movement called the Focolare movement. It's entirely lay, although some people take on a consecrated life, a life of celibacy and poverty within it, but not as monks, but as living people. They've set up 750 Catholic social teaching business parks around the world, across Latin America, across Africa, across Asia. And there they enable local people or groups to be trained in entrepreneurship, to be given the not only the financial support, but as Joe was pointing out, the psychological, spiritual support to keep on the straight and narrow when everything tends to sort of wobble off into the broad path rather than the narrow path, should we put it that way. And it's astonishing. And the Pope has just launched a whole thing called the Economy of Francesco, the Economy of St. Francis, which has brought together 3,000 young Catholic entrepreneurs. And then you've got the Christian business networks. Do you know that in China, there are 300 Christian millionaires who need to work out how to put their money invested for the gospel in China? You're part of an enormous movement. And Rob, back to your thing about hope. You know, I've worked with the environmental movement for 40 years, and very often I give up hope. I mean, one of the things I say to them, one of the gifts I think that we bring as religions is celebration. I say to them, you know, we celebrate. Yes, we tell people to fast for Lent and Advent, but then, boy, we have parties. You lot just tell us we have to fast for life. And that's not a very life-affirming model. And moreover, have you ever seen an environmental joke book? No, there isn't one. And until you can laugh at what you hold to be most important, you don't actually trust it. So we bring that sense of celebration, of possibility and hope. And I have to say, in the entrepreneurial world, it is the antidote to the we're all going down the plug hole of so much of the rest of the world's commentary. And okay, I've worked with charities all my life. Was I suspicious of business? You bet I was. Am I now thinking that was a big mistake? Partially.